I'd like to welcome everyone to the Technology Review Magazine's 2011 TR50 Awards event, the title of which is Creating Wealth Through Technology and Business Innovation. My name is Owen Cocking, and I'm currently serving as the chairman of the New York City chapter of the MIT Enterprise Forum. The MIT Enterprise Forum is a volunteer, not-for-profit organization with a network of about 28 chapters worldwide, 20 domestic and 8 international. Our mission is to be the leader in hosting network and educational events focused on the intersection of technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Here in New York, we host monthly events, about 10 to 12 a year, that typically attract in excess of about 100 people. We have about 300 to 320 members, along with a subscription list of about 5,000 people. I should also add, importantly, that we are not exclusionary. We don't exclude non-MIT alums from getting involved in our organization, neither in our membership, attending our events, serving as volunteers for the organization, or even being on the board. In a reflection of the reality of the technology entrepreneurship space, we are very inclusive, and we welcome the involvement of any non-MIT alumni. There are some that disagree with our policy, as you might imagine. And although we believe that a lot of good ideas have come from MIT, we also acknowledge that not every single good idea has come from MIT. For instance, I think those fellows at Google are doing pretty good without the MIT pedigree. Recently, as an example, our events have focused on media, information and technology, clean tech, biotechnology and healthcare, venture capital roundtables, and we do the occasional business plan presentation. You can learn much more about our organization if you go to our website. We're very fortunate to have Jason Pontin moderating our event tonight. Jason Pontin is the editor-in-chief of the Technology Review magazine, where he is responsible for the editorial direction of the award-winning magazine, as well as their website, technologyreview.com. Jason assumed the role of publisher for Technology Review in 2005, overseeing all aspects of the company's growth strategy, which includes the website, email newsletters, as well as an aggressive international expansion and signature events such as emerging technologies conferences. Most recently, Jason was editor-in-chief of the Acumen Journal, covering business, economic, and policy implications of discoveries in biotechnology and life sciences. Prior to that, from 1996 to 2002, Jason was the editor of the technology business magazine Red Herring, which was one of my all-time favorite magazines. I'm sure many of you also enjoyed it. In addition, he has written for many national and international publications, including The Economist, The Financial Times, Wired, and The Believer. He is a frequent guest on television and radio shows, including ABC News, CNN, and National Public Radio. Please join me in welcoming Jason Pontin.
Good evening, and thank you, Owen. I would like to begin by also thanking the New York chapter of the Enterprise Forum, and particularly the volunteers. The Enterprise Forum is a volunteer organization, and it wouldn't exist without the extraordinary enthusiasm and expertise of the volunteers themselves. Every year, Technology Review chooses the 50 companies we think are the most innovative ventures and businesses in the world. And let me tell you what the list is not. It is not a measure of market capitalization, and it's not a measure of revenue or even revenue growth. Because if it were, Microsoft and Intel would be on the list. And if you look at the issues, which I have left on your chairs, they're not. Instead, we have chosen 50 companies, 25 private and 25 public, which we believe are setting the agenda in some important way. And by that we mean they are either creating entirely new markets where none had existed before, or they're disrupting fruitfully markets that already exist. Tonight, I have brought 3 of the companies which I personally most admire on the TR50 list for you to meet. And I'm not going to spoil their thunder by telling you in too much detail why we love them so much. But let me just briefly say who's up here with me and just at a high level what we think their core innovation is. Sitting directly to my right is Andrew Madden, who works in strategic partnerships at Google. We chose Google not just because it's Google, but because we believe that they continue to be the leader, not just in web search, but in what we think is the most important cutting edge in technology, which are these, which are putting mobile computers into the hands of every living single person on the earth. Sitting next to him is one of the most extraordinary entrepreneurs I know, Dave Berry of Flagship Ventures. This guy normally sits on at least 3, sometimes 7 different companies as its CEO. He's an MIT PhD and a Harvard MD, but he is here tonight to go and represent an extraordinary company called Joule. Joule is a biofuels company, but it doesn't use recombinant technology to create biofuels from biomass. It does it directly from the sun and from the air. And finally, on my far right is David Vieau of A123 Systems, which is certainly one of the most publicized and highly capitalized companies in the battery space, but we also think it is setting the agenda for what a modern batteries company should look like. Now, before I begin, I know that a few of you are shy, not many, but a few of you are shy. So what I'm going to suggest is if you are too shy to interrupt me and ask questions, you pose me questions on the Twitter stream. And the tag is this, hashtag MITEFTR50. And I'm going to be watching it. You can say rude things about me in my panelists as well, and I'll read them out. I won't see where they come from. You'll need possibly to use the Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi here is NYAS guest, and then 321 NAS guest. Before I begin, let me say I'm going to go to questions from the audience as quickly as I can, but don't use that as the opportunity to put off. If these guys say anything that you want to drill down on, stand up, interrupt, because we're going to have an interactive conversation. So I'm going to begin by asking each one of the panelists, starting with David. I'm going to call David Vieau David and Dave Berry Dave. And ask David to say a few words about the essential innovation of A123 Systems.
Thank you very much, everybody. So A123 Systems was a spin-off out of MIT 9 years ago. Actually, I joined A123 there were 7 of us 9 years ago this week. And the technology came out of MIT's lab, Professor Yet-Ming Chang, where he created a new nanomaterial we call a nanophosphate, which had the possibility of improving lithium-ion battery characteristics, the active ingredient in the cathode in a lithium-ion battery. At the time, if you think about lithium-ion batteries, or batteries back at that point in time, the characterization around cell phones and laptops was improving the weight, the energy density, but with a fairly limited life. They typically last a year to 2 years in terms of their ability to hold their energy level, which we would turn around and call that maybe 300 or 400 life cycles, charges and discharges in the cycle. They also had some characterization of what we call being thermally unstable. Sometimes they would blow up.
He's not joking. Traditional Li-ion really do blow up if you drop them hard enough.
Yeah. And the goal around them was all very, very much an energy-dense product, but not really much care about power. And so battery characterization at the time, when you thought about applying a battery to an active product where you needed power, they were considered wimpy. If you tried a power tool that used a battery, for example, they were relatively wimpy. They weren't really much like what you could get off of a cord set. So what we created was something that had extremely better power. We could get multiple times the power capability of previous generations, better safety, much more thermally stable, and better life characteristic than those that buy maybe 20 times. We could do 8,000, 10,000 life cycles on these things, fully charged and discharged. So it empowered applications that hadn't been thought of for batteries previously. We could think about making cord sets, or excuse me, making power tools that would have more power than the standard 115 volt outlet, where you might be limited to 1,500 watts or 2,000 watts. We could deliver more than that on a battery, which was kind of unheard of at the time. And we envisioned using these things in applications in automotive, but there wasn't really a significant demand in the automotive world for that, principally because of battery limitations, really. If you look back in the 90s at the death of the EV, it was really around the limited capabilities of batteries. So well, the innovation was around a material but it was also around the potential for the material to turn into a product. So we generated new cell technology with innovation in the actual cells themselves and new systems. And we created systems that could deliver the power capability that was there in that basic energy and that basic material. So from a little thimble of material, we started generating cells and then larger systems. We had to find a way to sell these things, so we looked at innovative partners that we could deal with. We worked with somebody who built the fastest motorcycle ever made, fastest electric motorcycle ever made, and goes 0 to 60 in less than a second. And we overcame the myth that batteries were wimpy, if you know what I mean. We put batteries together for McLaren and Mercedes and the F1 racing team, and we did some real innovation. We generated 20,000 watts per kilogram, 10 times what we had as a commercial product, and helped them power their way to the podium with this battery-assisted Formula One race car on the racing circuit a few years ago. And we teamed up with a little entrepreneurial company that was doing basically makeovers of a Toyota Prius to make it from a traditional full hybrid into a plug-in hybrid, and we could then generate interest about what these batteries could do. So I think we provided innovation in the chemistry, innovation in the cell technology and the systems, and also in the marketplace to say, hey, this is what you can do with these batteries. And today we make batteries for many automakers, passenger cars, and also for the grid. We make batteries that support very, very large loads on the grid with multiple megawatt systems.
How many vehicles do you support now?
Well, we've
got... How many countries?
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 or 4 passenger car companies that are launching products with our product in it. BMW is one of them. Fisker, you'll see, is a company. The Fisker Karma is coming out in the next few months. It's a wonderful, wonderful car that I think is a great combination of internal combustion engine and extended range with battery power capability, and we're dealing with batteries on the largest car company in China. Has got 3 different models coming out. We're the largest supplier of batteries for heavy duty, for buses and trucks. In New York, not all, but the majority of the buses, all the buses that have been built in the last few years, utilize our batteries for their hybrid systems. So we power the Daimler Orion 7 bus system, and buses in Germany with Daimler, and buses out of Volvo that are launching right now with this technology, with Eaton Corporation, Navistar Corporation, and a host of others, actually. So heavy-duty bus and truck applications, passenger car applications, and the like.
And for those who don't know in the audience, could you explain why moving into grid battery storage is so important for the future of intermittent power, of alternative energy?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things. We could, for one thing, the first step into the batteries for the grid was working with a partner, AES, which is a power generator out of Virginia. And the idea there was you could use a clean source of energy storage to help balance the energy capability of the grid today. So today we have gas-powered generators that allow you to augment the existing generation capability to pulse power in or receive power back out. So basically, this capability was there. But if you look at a bigger picture of what you can do, and think about renewable energy, right now one of the limitations of renewable energy is its intermittency. And that transition of the sun going behind a cloud or the wind going on and off is unhealthy for the grid. It doesn't like to get turned on and off when you have large scale. Starting off where we are now, not so bad. As you think of it in a larger scale, one of the problems you run into is that the grid does not like to be turned on and off instantly. You want to be able to transition. So what we can do with these large batteries is we can act as a buffer. And in large scale, we can also act a little bit in arbitrage. We can capture energy when you maybe not need it on the grid, and we can deliver it. So we're working on large scale energy storage systems. We have a 32 megawatt hour system we're building with Southern California Edison that will be used on their wind farm. And today, frankly, they're a bit expensive, but we've got projections of cost, benefit, and returns on that make an awful lot of sense. And I think what you'll hear a lot about are what they call stranded capacity. These are renewable energy farms, wind or solar, that cannot take full advantage of what they have because of transmission limitations or because of other on-off load balancing capabilities. Batteries will buffer that for certain, and there'll be a variety of different technologies. We think we've got one.
Thank you. Dave, what does Joule do?
Sure. So let me give a little bit of context before I talk about Joule. So I'm a partner at Flagship. I help to run a group that we have, which we call Flagship Venture Labs. And what we do there is the exact opposite of venture capital. So what venture capital does is really waits for ideas to come to them. They have hypotheses, and they try to best impose their hypotheses on the investments that are available and make do with what they can, in a simplistic way of saying it and hoping for the best at the end of the day. what we try to do is look for the intersection between market pull and the potential for technology solution, come up with ideas, rapidly iterate them, and build companies from scratch, coming up with technologies on our own, and basically using the companies that we form effectively as our labs, and those companies being their own incubator. So Joule is a company we founded out of Venture Labs in 2007. And the impetus for Joule was we'd been involved in biofuels. We had invested in a company called Mascoma that's doing cellulosic ethanol, and founded a company called LS9 that's basically, you could say, doing cellulosic diesel if you wanted to lump it into something. The challenge with all these companies is they're dependent on sugar. In 2005, the price of sugar was about 4 to 6 cents a pound. Today, it's 31 cents a pound. And if you're dependent for every carbon that you want to spit out as diesel or ethanol or whatever on that sugar, your price point is going to be intricately and intimately related to that cost of sugar. So we asked the question, how do we break the back of that? And in 2007, trying to look forward, the one commodity that looked like it was really well positioned was carbon dioxide, in that, you know, we thought we had some policies that were going to come around and whatnot. But the interesting thing about it is it actually has very stable pricing, independent of whether this administration or our Congress can get off its ass and figure this stuff out, which I won't even start on that. Europe has priced it. There is a pricing mechanism that exists. And frankly, Kinder Morgan and others sell CO2 as a commodity. So we know exactly what the price is going to be. And there's very predictable costing that you can do around that. So that had us ask the question of, one, can you use CO2? How do you use it? And two, if you're going to completely change the way you do biofuels, what would the ideal biofuel be? So we wanted to figure out a way to make something that used CO2, that minimized net greenhouse gas over the entire life cycle, real life cycle, not an arbitrary subcomponent of the life cycle, that didn't depend on arable land, that minimized the use of fresh water, and that was incredibly scalable. And that point I just want to hit home on, because when you look at traditional biofuels, they scale in 3 dimensions. So you do a pilot plant, then you kind of go blindly into a demo plant that costs you about $20 million. And then all of a sudden you have to go and ask people for $150 to $300 million, scaling a process in 3 dimensions for which everyone knows there's a huge amount of risk in that. And it turns out people don't like spending $300 million on things where they don't yet know that it's going to work. So we tried to solve all of that. And what we ultimately designed was, by looking at the way cells that have been commonly industrialized, like E. coli, have been engineered, is we recognize that effectively they're catalysts. So they take in an input, whatever it happens to be, through the engineering that's done, you streamline all the processes that are in there, and you spit out your end product. And it depends on exactly what that product is, how much you actually spit it out or whatnot. But we realized what we want to do is take photosynthetic cells, because they use light, sunlight, CO2, and they need to be in the context of water in that they split it, but it doesn't actually have to be fresh water. It can be salt water. They prefer salt water. They take energy in, they take carbon in, and when we rewire the entirety of central metabolism, we basically make these cells into catalysts that directly spit out a fuel or a chemical. And at Joule, we've now made about 14 different fuels and chemicals. Our focus is on diesel, because it turns out it's a really good way to run a car or a truck or all sorts of other transportation vehicles, et cetera, but we can also make all sorts of petrochemical derivatives. We can make ethanol, and see that as a plethora of opportunities that we can systematically pursue. But the organism itself is not enough. The organism actually needs a reactor system. One, because you want to enclose it. If you put a photosynthetic organism in the open, turns out things like to eat it. Algae and other such things, although we're not using algae, form the basis of a lot of the food chain. So we want to protect what we're doing from everything else. But at the same time, we are heavily genetically engineering our organisms, and people like that to be contained. So we recognize both of that. But it's not a passive reactor. The reactor that we designed looks a lot like a solar cell. One of the beauties of a solar cell is it has modular scalability. So you make one, and it works. You have a fabrication system, and all of a sudden you make 10, and they work basically the same as 1. After you've made 10, you make 100. They work the same as 10. They work the same as 1. And so our idea was, well, if we can build a pilot plant that was perhaps 50 to 100 of these, then we know that the modules, the reactors, the process, all of that works. And as we want to scale up, all we got to do is make more. But the reactor itself also deals with a set of intricacies about how do you optimize the cell from functioning. So we make sure we mix CO2 in the proper way. And there's sort of just as one example, a really interesting idiosyncratic thing about photosynthetic organisms. It turns out they don't like constant light. Who would have thunk? So it turns out we have to cycle them between light and dark in a very, very fast way to basically match the way they like to take in light and optimize the efficiencies of these organisms. So it's a complex systems-based solution that we use to effectively convert sunlight, CO2, and water directly into our end product. And this company has been up and running. It was founded in 2007. Our lab's opened in 2008. We have a pilot plant that's been up and running for about 8 months now in Leander, Texas, and we'll be in the near future raising money to put our first commercial plant in the ground.
Whenever I think of Joule, it reminds me of that famous remark of Arthur C. Clarke that any sufficiently emerging technology seems like magic. Explain to me a little bit about why some of your competitors, and you don't have to mention names, have found it so difficult to scale. So there's some very highly publicized companies founded shortly before Joule, including one of Dave's own companies, LS9, who have experienced more difficulties in scaling than Joule has seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, there's two challenges at hand. One is the technology.
Money.
Well, that's an important one.
Yeah.
There's a couple of challenges at hand. One is it's a three-dimensional problem, and chemical engineering doesn't like to scale well. Sunlight is inherently two-dimensional when you think about it in the context of the surface of the Earth. And so we get to simplify the way that we scale. Second, the process that we designed was designed with the end in mind. And so we basically started thinking about what the full-scale plant was going to look like and basically reverse engineered how do we get to there from here. And that makes it a lot easier than saying, can we do a proof of concept, and then can we scale this up, and then can we scale this up, because you come into more problems in those sorts of ways. And then money is a very big one, because when you scale into the unknown, again, people don't want to take those sorts of risks. When you know what your larger scale plants are going to look like, it's easier to convince people to make a financial bet, because frankly, I can give them an IRR or an ROI calculation today and tell them, with my process at this point in its development, it's going to look like this for you.
Where do you think we are with the use of marginal land to grow things like jatropha or switchblade grass for biomass, for biofuels?
Very, very early.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been tested out. There's some interesting early promising results. That hasn't really been done at scale, and it's hard to know what the data actually means at such the small scales that they've been done at today.
So we really are dependent at the moment upon common sugar sources
Right.
for biofuels. Thank you, David. So Google's a multifaceted company, and there are so many ways we could approach it. But I outlined two of the reasons we were interested, that Google has maintained its dominance in search despite a decade of challenges, and also because of their increasing innovations on these. So I don't know how you want to talk about your company, Andrew, but maybe choose a couple of things.
Well, first of all, thank you for including Google, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the company. Yes, the company is diverse and multifaceted. I think the mobile example is as good as any, though. When we acquired the company that at the time was called Android, it was a fairly small company and a kind of a group of elite engineers. That's also fairly typical of Google acquisition, where we're looking for great engineers to come in and help develop great products. The innovation that has taken place within the Android platform, I think even by Google standards, has been fairly stunning. Huge penetration in a relatively short period of time. I think something on the order of 300,000 devices are activated every day that have the Android operating system built in. That's a big number, and it also happens on a global scale. Any product that is launched at Google has a mandate to get global very quickly. So we may be based in California, but we want to get out there quickly on a global scale. So certainly Android continues to be a major area of focus for the company, and it also helps bring people back to execute searches, which is obviously of key interest to us. Another area that continues to, I think, exceed internal expectations is the continued growth of the YouTube platform. This is also something which, if you stand back and look at it, it's really a staggering achievement in terms of the size of the platform and the global reach. On any given day, based on query volume, YouTube on its own is one of the largest search engines in the world, aside from the queries that come through google.com. So an enormous amount of traffic comes through there. And then a really staggering amount of video every second is uploaded to YouTube. And this now has enormous and important social, political consequences. It's a platform that people really rely on, in addition to squirrels that are skateboarding and stuff like that, which is always interesting. But for instance, even the recent events in Japan, YouTube has been a huge source of information as people go and try to see what has taken place there. And again, YouTube, much like Android, was a very small company when we bought it and had a very small group of employees, but were kind of given an environment in which to really grow on a scale that they would have not really been able to on their own.
Your outgoing chief executive, Eric Schmidt, always used to talk very winningly that eventually an innovation would come along that Google was ill-suited to vanquish. And I wonder how you think about the social net. So far, most of Google's efforts in this area, whether it's been Buzz or Wave, have not been very successful. And I think we've all seen Facebook begin to insert itself into almost everything that we do. We sign on to websites using Facebook. We visit editorial publishing sites and we see what our friends are doing. How is Google going to respond to the social net?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, that continues to be an area of great interest to us, and I think it's worth mentioning that even before there was a Facebook, we've had many kind of tools in the toolbox that have great social elements to them. Gmail itself is a great social tool. And then to mention Facebook again, Facebook has a huge number of features built into it that make it a de facto social network. And then Google, of course, has always had a direct investment in social networks through Orkut, which was developed by a lone Google engineer, and then became the most popular social network in Brazil, of all places. But it's an area of great focus and interest in the company. I think the other thing that the way we like to look at it is that with all of the success that Facebook has had, it's a big world out there, and it's not a zero-sum game, I think, as well.
I seem to be asking Andrew the harder questions this evening, but I'm going to ask him a question which he actually works on. So how are you going to allow businesses like mine to flourish and prosper? So, I mean, in my world, people often talk about Google in ambivalent terms. On the one hand, we value the enormous traffic and the attention which we get. At the same time, I remember a publisher once likened Google to this gigantic vacuum that sucks, value out of his business. And I know you've been working very hard on trying to help me make money and be sustainable. So how do you do that, please?
Sure. Yeah, I spend a lot of time with traditional publishers, the big newspaper companies, the large magazine conglomerates, and there is a lot of concern about where does one business go, particularly after the downturn which started in 2008. As Jason knows, that had a grave impact on the publishing business overall, as marketers pulled back dramatically in terms of what they were willing to spend. That said, things like the Android platform and the emergence of tablets create a pretty compelling and exciting new opportunity. an executive at one of the largest publishing companies in the world recently said in a meeting that we were attending that in his opinion this was a Gutenberg moment for the publishing industry, where they could start to think about how to develop for tablets in a way that most publishers, I think, would confess at this point they kind of missed on the web. The web, the migration of a traditional magazine into the web environment was largely a big miss by most publishers. It just didn't quite do what it needed to do in order to keep audiences and readers engaged. So as we look at the Android platform and at tablets specifically, the first Android tablets have started to come online. We think there are interesting ways that we can work with publishers there. We've also recently launched a payments and authentication platform, which is a really inexpensive way for a publisher who doesn't want to spend a lot of time investing in technology on their own site and developing an authentication system. You can use this project called Google OnePass, which would allow you to do it inexpensively on an experimental basis and retaining nearly all the revenue from that as well.
Thank you, Andrew. One of you nerds has made this into a full square hangout, so and has just checked in. So thank you. I remind you again, the Twitter stream is on hashtag MITEFTR50. And please, as you have questions, stand up and interrupt. So I want to talk a bit about where these folks are coming from. Who they are. They've talked about their companies and their innovations. I know most of the folks in the room are themselves technologists, innovators, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists. And so these folks have had the interesting experience in most cases of having worked in a variety of circumstances. So perhaps David Berry could begin by saying, where are you coming from? How did you get here? You have, I should say he was our Innovator of the Year in 2008, was it? Seven. Good. So I know it bugs me to hell as well that he's like 17, but he's done so many companies, and it's interesting to me how he manages to balance all those different demands.
It's an interesting question. I attribute most of it to a version of ADD. If I look back and people ask me how I got motivated to do what I do, I always say I was born to be a skier, and most of my career decisions have resulted out of a false attempt to try to become an Olympic skier that never manifested. And when I realized that wasn't going to work out, turned out through a set of weird activities, got interested in medicine, realized one of the challenges with medicine, very simply, is it's an ingrained field. People get taught a set way of doing things, and despite the fact that everyone who's in the field really wants to do what's best for their patients, it's a field that really doesn't want to innovate. And I can think very clearly of a set of experiences I had while I was on the wards during my medical training, where you'd look at a patient and you'd look at the specific context of the disease that patient has in the context of that patient, and you say, you know what? Something doesn't feel right about standard of care here. And you start asking attendings the question of, well, what if we recognize the similarity between the disease as it's presenting today and this disease over here? And of course, every time you do this, and I did it way too many times and somehow still graduated med school without getting kicked out, they'd say, that's not standard of care. Do you want to harm your patient? And I'd say, on the contrary, I actually want to try to figure out something that's good for the patient. And it's interesting, I realized being a doctor wasn't going to be for me because that inquisitive sort of nature where I think you can start to drive care forward wasn't there. And ended up putting a PhD on top of my MD and got very interested in sort of the entrepreneurial space along the way. And of course, I did my PhD with Bob Langer, who I think has trained more entrepreneurs and venture capitalists than probably anyone else. Put two and two together, and it ultimately led me to get a job at Flagship. And the thing that I loved about Flagship, from my perspective, it was basically an opportunity to be sort of a professor that didn't have to get grants, so I could do the same sort of experimentation. I didn't have to get tenure, so I could do things in a bunch of different ways. And when I was hired, they basically gave me an empty desk and said, go. And so I've started at Flagship now 7 companies, I believe, 3 of which are in energy or fuels, one of which is in nutrition, and a bunch that are in therapeutics. So going all over the place from that standpoint. And it's nice to know that there's no real reins that have to constrain it.
Physically, how do you manage to be the CEO of 3 companies at once? I mean, physically, how do you do that?
Well, I don't actually do much. My assistant is phenomenal. A lot of there's a couple of things. One is it's all about hiring great people. No effort that I do is me alone. It's always teams that we build, and I spend a lot of time making sure that our teams are built with the best people with an open culture, and that's incredibly important in terms of being able to be successful. Everyone knows that it's a busy environment, but every company that I'm building is something that's striving for a goal that hasn't yet been reached, and everyone's very focused on doing that. So they make my job very easy.
Thank you. David Vieau, you've worked at some very big companies, and then you joined, as you said, you joined A123 Systems, and there were 7 people. So perhaps you could talk a bit about your personal journey from companies where innovation is notionally encouraged but difficult, to a company whose basic business model is continuous innovation.
Well, I ask this question sometimes when I interview people if I'm looking for someone that I think that needs an entrepreneurial capability within the corporation, and I'll ask it, try and go back and say, did you start any companies when you were young? Did you do anything innovative when you were in high school or whatever? A friend of mine and I were 12 years old. We started our own lawn care business, doing a variety of services for people, and kept doing things like that, going off instead of going off and getting a traditional job. I went to work for Texas Instruments out of college as an engineer, and it was a very, very structured environment. But after about 8 or 9 months, I was a mechanical engineer. One of my partners was a double E. We said, instead of buying monitors for these military applications, why don't we figure out how to source that in-house? We'll do it ourselves. So we went around and got the division manager in this group to agree to sponsor us to build our own business within the business. And instead of buying stuff, we started making it. We designed, developed, and then we started going around selling them what we had done in these high-definition monitors internally within the company. So it was sort of an entrepreneurial experience. And I ended up in a group at TI that was part of the initiation of programmable logic controllers, PLCs. I don't know if you know them, but it was back in the 70s when industry was automated with electromechanical devices, relays, and some combination of those things, prior microprocessors being employed significantly. And that was my first industry-changing event. This wasn't about an innovation. This was about how do you take an industry that's sort of stuck in this one paradigm of electromechanical devices and move them into the age of a microprocessor when nobody really wants it. I mean, the entire distribution channel didn't want it. The people that use them didn't want them. The operators didn't want them. And then you had to say, well, the innovation is great, but how do you make that change? And I really like that. I like the idea of the challenge of not only making the product, but then changing the industry. And we changed the distribution model. There was a new company that just started then called Federal Express, and they had a way of getting products around faster than the other ones, and we figured out how to use them to depot things and change the distribution channel. And the whole model was different, not just the product. So I really like that. And I went to a startup company in Woburn, Mass. that had patented touch panels, the first real touch-sensitive panels. So instead of electromechanical switches that you'd pound and hit, these things were little sensitive, and gaming companies started up making little handheld microprocessor games. And I had to go around and try and change people's thinking about what a switch is. People say, that's not a switch. Yeah, it's a switch. It doesn't, but I can't feel it. You can't feel it, but it's actually switching. And believe it or not, it was a big deal in the 70s that it didn't appear to be a switch. And if you went to an appliance company, they said, no one's going to know that you touched it. Well, we can figure out how to convince them of that, but they didn't want to use them. And so I got involved in that, and that's when I got the bug, and I've been either starting or restarting some companies ever since.
Thanks. I should confess that Andrew, Madden, and I have a background. We worked at Red Herring during the 90s. He then started another company, now works at a very large company. So I'm interested in how it feels going from having worked at the worst managed startup in the Valley. We burned through $70 million in about 7 years.
But we had a good time doing it.
We had a great time. To starting your own company, and now to having to innovate within a company that values innovation, but now has 20,000 employees?
Somewhere between 25 and 30, I think. But yeah, it's a big adjustment coming to a large company. When I first interviewed at Google in early 2005, it was about 3,000 people. And to me, that was a mind-boggling number. I talked with a gentleman when I got here earlier tonight who said that when he joined AT&T, they had 1 million employees. So pre-divestiture. So you know, I guess by comparison, I still work at a startup. But Google has always modeled itself as obviously a highly innovative company that's largely achieved organizationally through a kind of a matrix setup where we go after problems or issues or new projects in small groups. And those are cross-functional groups that represent every part of the company. So engineering, product development, partnerships, business development, legal, and so on. And we operate almost as small groups within the large company. And you can imagine that, in fact, you have these small groups, often which are working on competing initiatives. And that's a very healthy approach, I think, to innovation, that you have this competition. It's important that the competition be collegial, because I think there are many examples in large companies where the competition is not collegial, and different groups within the company are out for blood. And that I think there are some famous stories, I'm sure, and case studies of where this has happened, where good projects are killed because of the political influence that another group has. I think Google manages to do a relatively good job of keeping these groups moving along on parallel tracks, and again, I think of embracing that the competitive spirit.
So Andrew's actually leapt ahead to my final question before I turn it to the audience, which is about how the companies these gentlemen work for maintain a culture of innovation. I think anyone who's ever worked with smart people knows that the resource deficit is never good ideas, right? Great companies have often too many ideas, but it's how you execute on the innovative notions that are thrown up and choose the best ones. I would like David Vieau to talk a little bit about how A123 Systems does that, but perhaps you could also tell the story about the early days of the company, because the innovation you guys thought you were bringing to market was in fact not the innovation that has made you affluent. So.
Yeah, well, we did license 2 bits of technology from MIT. The first one was basically upon which the company was named, around the Hammacher force constant. The A sub 123 is defined as a formula that defines the force constant between small particles, and the idea was to make a battery that would form itself at nanoscale. And it actually didn't work very well. I mean, Yet-Ming Chang would probably disagree with me in the sense it didn't work fully. Right? And so we had some problems, and we ended up having to shift off to that, the second bit of technology upon which we built the company. But on the point of entrepreneurship in the company and how do you maintain that, it is a challenge. I think as you start off, everything is about the idea, and everyone's wrapped around the idea, and it's quite relatively simple in terms of motivation, because you can put it out there, you know what you've got a relatively narrow thing that you're working on, and you're going after it. And then it starts to mushroom into a bigger thing. But the sustainability of that depends on execution and operations, and the skill sets that brought you there aren't necessarily the skill sets that get you to the next stage. And you typically bring in or develop more managing skills, I think more operating skills. I think the people, if I were to take into 2 groups, I'd say builders versus operators. It's not that black and white, obviously there's a spectrum, but if you think about builders versus operators, and quite often I see companies that say, I've got to start a new venture, I'm going to bring in this guy, he's really run lots and lots of large companies. I say he's an operator and he's going to have a hell of a time building, right? It's a different thing when you have a blank sheet of paper. So one of the problems that we ran into, and I see, is that the innovators, the really creative people, really don't like the operating side. And what happens in little companies, you get sucked along. They have to become operators because you don't have anybody else to do it. And they find themselves frustrated quite often. They'll roll off and they'll go someplace else. And you can lose your innovative side. So we, over the course of time, have found ways to employ them in a variety of different scenarios. And one recently we did was we spun off a company that called 24M that was based on an innovation from A123, complemented by work at MIT, and ultimately created a pretty interesting idea for how to create a lower cost energy source for automotive and for grid systems.
But David, why wasn't 24M appropriate to be commercialized within the context of A123?
Well, it was a bit afield technically from where we were, and it was going to require an awful lot of resources, and we thought the spirit of entrepreneurship that causes you to forge ahead against a lot of obstacles was going to be required in the funding. So we said, the best thing to do here would be, if this is going to survive and really thrive, tough challenge, but tremendous idea, was to give it its own life, and we brought in some venture capitalists and set up a separate company to go do that. We took a lesser share from what we had, but we took a position that allows us, upon the success of this group of entrepreneurs, to pull it back. If you know, depending, it's a certain economic equation, but the sense of it that it would go faster, better, stronger that way, and we kept focusing our efforts on the maybe narrower space that we're in with lithium-ion batteries.
Thank you. Dave Berry, how do you think about continuous innovation inside the various companies you manage, but particularly Joule? Because in most of the companies you've founded, you enter these marketplaces by no means having all the answers for how you're going to get to a commercial product. So continuous innovation, to some degree, is the lifeblood of your companies.
Sure. So I think there's a handful of things at play. First of all, with Joule, it's a company that, just because of where it is, fosters a very innovative spirit. First and foremost, we have a number of people who love to tell us that we can't do what we're doing. And nothing inspires the sorts of people that we have than saying the science that we're achieving in our labs and the science that works in Texas is physically impossible. And so reminding everyone that, you know, this will only work when pigs fly is a very inspiring thing. And so actually we have a bunch of pigs that are hanging on the ceiling throughout the through the offices.
That's cute.
So, you know, that's of course very, very useful. But at the same time, we've been very focused on hiring people who can think and focus in an innovative way. The first employee we hired, a guy named Dan Robertson, came from an academic and then joined a company when it was small and watched it as it went big, and then stayed with it as it went smaller, and was very experienced in his field. And I remember one of the lines when he accepted the offer, he said, "You know what? I have to reference Kirk Gibson when I say I feel like I got one more good swing in me." And you know, it's that sort of spirit where everyone wants to put it all on the line to make it happen. When every single person that you hire has that mentality, especially in the early days, it becomes something that's truly infectious. The final thing I'd say is, for a company like Joule, when you think about the ultimate potential that it has of producing diesel at 15,000 gallons per acre per year at a cost point as low as about $20 a barrel, and basically can make reserves on land, on demand, above ground, basically so long as there's cash, it starts to allow you to start changing the way that you want to think. And once you can think about those sorts of potentials, people's minds get captured, and it fosters the innovation to really make that a reality. We don't know what challenges we're going to have. We tell people to push up against the walls, and if you start a fight, we'll settle that later on, but it's more important that we solve the problem.